You haven't changed in 20 years. And I go, I looked this bad 20 years ago.
Live from the Talking Joe Studios. It's Talking Joe.
Talking Joe is on the air.
Hey, it's me, Mark, and welcome to Talking Joe, the G.I. Joe Comics podcast. Today, we are talking to special guest artist Mike Vosburgh. Now, Mike Vosburgh is an artist that you will know from G.I. Joe. His comics career began in 1962, producing his own fanzine before working in Underground Comics and going on to create comics for Marvel, DC, Valiant, and more, including the likes of his own creator series like Laurie Lovecraft. He created comic covers for the Tales of the Crypt TV show, has worked as a storyboard artist, and much more besides. But importantly for us today, he was the artist on the G.I. Joe comic books for most of the issues 9 through to 23, as well as a storyboard artist on the G.I. Joe cartoon. But I will not be talking to him alone today. I will be joined, as always, by my co-host. It's a Real American Tim. It's Tim Finn.
Hello, Mark, and hello, listeners and viewers. Let's bring on our guest.
Here we go. It's Mike.
Good morning, all.
Morning, Mike.
Welcome, Mike.
Mike said good morning because he's in California, where it's the morning, and I'm in Massachusetts, where it's the afternoon, and Mark is in England, where it's dinner time.
Tea time. So, Mike, let's, before we get too stuck into lots of questions, why don't you tell us a bit about the space that we find you in today? It looks like a bustling studio room with lots and lots of stuff in there.
Well, the first thing, or the best thing my wife and I did with the house we live in, we converted the garage that was here into studio space. And if you look over there, there's her half of the studio. She works in that half. And over here is my half of the studio. Back in this corner behind my right shoulder there is, you can see a whole wall of books there. And those are all just life drawing sketchbooks that I've filled up over the past 30 or 40 years. And when I started in comics, I had absolutely no idea how to draw. I knew nothing about drawing. I knew how to copy people that I liked, but I didn't know anything about the actual drawing process. So once I got my first job, I thought, geez, I really probably should learn how to draw. And I've spent the last 40, 50 years now trying to catch up. That's pretty much, it's like, stacks of whatever I can do to keep drawing every day is it's kind of my motivation.
I can see a drawing table behind you, and it looks like an artboard on the table, so sort of in mid drawing still.
That's an easel my wife bought me. One of the things I do to pass the time is I do all my little cat drawings there, and they're fun to pass out to people and to friends and whatever. Like everything else, they force you to learn a little bit more about drawing.
And directly behind you, is that an angled table with a comics page on it?
You're seeing more than I do. Oh, I see what you're talking about. Yeah, that's when I'm working on comics or anything. I'm working on that space. Once the pages are finished, I'll scan them in and I move over to this space, my computer. So one of the things my dad taught me was how to do my own bookcases and such. So I mean, that's one of the things I immediately did in here is built shelf space that actually fit things. It's like you can look on the other side here. I built like a space where I can work on my watercolors, library, all my music to listen to, and whatever. So yeah, it's quite comfortable.
You mentioned, of course, you were at a computer right now. When did you bring a computer into your studio and learn it and software and scanning?
I worked on the Tales from the Crypt show. I used to do all the comic book covers for them, and we would do these when we wanted to color the covers. We would shoot a negative put it on a big board, coat it with chemicals, leave it out in the sun for about 30 minutes, and that would create a blue line that we would work on. And it was a tedious process, and you couldn't make a lot of mistakes. So one year I decided, well, I'm just going to take the money I make from Tales from the Crypt, and I'm going to invest it into computer equipment, which was about $20,000 at the time. And I remember buying all this new equipment and starting, I think, probably in about the third season of Tales, so that'd be like 91 or 92. And I started coloring all the covers digitally, which was great for me. It wasn't great for Joel Silver because he used to get all the Blue Line originals. But since there were no more Blue Line originals, it wasn't part of the process.
Joel Silver being the producer of that HBO TV show.
Right. It was
Okay.
Richard Donner, Joel Silver, and Bob Zemeckis were all that. And the funny thing was must have been about 4 or 5 years later, I replaced all the equipment because it was all old. And I think to replace the entire equipment was about $4,000. That's how much things changed over those past years. The only things that were still as expensive were, I think, the Wacom tablet, that you draw on, and what else was there? There maybe the printers were still kind of moving along there, printer scanner. But no, I said I consider myself a Luddite for the most part. I have learned an awful lot about what you can do in terms of creating artwork on a computer. I mean, one of the things I discovered was that when you talk to anyone about, like working in Photoshop or whatever, you'll always go like, oh, they're the expert. And what you'll discover is that they do one thing and they're an expert at it. But Photoshop is so all-encompassing. In fact, all the digital programs are just, they continue to morph and change so rapidly that if you're an expert on Monday, you're a has-been on Friday. So, like I said, for what I do on computers, I always have the option to continue to create. For one thing, I can letter, I can color, I can print, all those things that when I was starting out in the business, you didn't have any of those options.
Yeah, what I was actually surprised by was that when you put together this particular image, so this was a commission for Chief, who was the original host of this podcast, Talking Joe, and he asked you for a commission with the Talking Joe logo that you added in with Cobra Commander and Baroness. And alongside the inked artwork that you sent to Chief, you also put together some colours on it as well. So I think that was a surprise for both of us that you added that in as an extra, because I guess the stereotypical thing is that sort of a lot of artists of a particular generation are comfortable with the analog kind of tools and don't necessarily sort of switch over to the digital and are sort of are quite so comfortable both in digital and the analog.
Now, when I was working, I used to work, I storyboarded the 3 Chronicles of Narnia films. And we had a younger storyboard artist with us. And anytime we'd get an interview, he'd always refer to me as like, oh, Mike's the old-fashioned guy. He, in terms of youth pictures, and he's, it's like he does stuff the old-fashioned way. And it's like, I continually had to remind him, like, hey, I've been working on a computer since 1992 when you were in junior high.
I think another exciting point to be made here is one that, Mike, you just made subtly, which is that you have continued to learn and teach yourself and sharpen your skills. And I think there's another notion of the established comic book artist who is so busy hustling for work and drawing work that they don't have time to take life drawing classes or teach themselves to paint, or if they scan and do Photoshop, it's some bare minimum stuff to sort of adjust the artwork before they send it on to the inker or the editor. And you are very much not just a professional artist, but a lifelong learner, to use a kind of buzzword. And it's clear from the space around you. It's
self-preservation. If you're going to work in art or entertainment or whatever, again, when I came in, I knew nothing, but I was, I had this youthful arrogance of like, oh, I can do that. But things will continually change. I mean, right now, all the artists are freaking out about AI. and probably with good reason. But the thing is, you can freak out about it, or you can simply learn the process. It's like AI, like the computer, is one more tool you can use as an artist. So it's like, how do I use this tool and remain so that you're not a visual thief, and B, to figure out ways to bring this into the work that's being done. And again, these things change so rapidly that just about the time you thought, okay, I really know this program, that program's obsolete. So just the process of, I used to refer to Marvel Comics as kind of the industry where people creatively married their cousins too often. It was like, we learned how to do things one way and we're never going to change. All the guys who really were like Chaikin and Frank Miller and Mike Mignola, guys who are really their own man in terms of being creative. They didn't stick to that Marvel style. They created their own work and set out on their own. They moved, movies, whatever. And I think that's what you have to remember is like Chaikin and I shared a studio, and he used to tell a young artist, you're not, because they would come and go, I want to draw comics. And he'd go, no. What you want to do is you want to work for a client who who has a comic book company, and you give them the work. But that's just one of your clients. You could have them doing whatever. So I'm not. There seems to be a few people out there, I'm sure, that worked in comics from the time they were teenagers until they retired or fell under their drawing boards, whatever. But for the most part, like I said, things will change around you, and you have to be ready to adapt to that.
Your formal education, I think, didn't you study at college English literature or something like that? Is that right?
My BA was in English literature, and after I got out of college, I taught school for 3 years. And I always regretted, like, God, I never went to art school. I never took classes. But then when I look back on it, I realized that what I learned in my English literature background was the concept of story. What was important in story, and story, I think, is like in the medium that we do. Story is far more important than how good an artist you are or not. I mean, truly, one of the guys in the business that the artwork had a lot of draftsman problems, a lot of other problems in him, but just took the comics world by storm was Jim Steranko. I mean, it's like he always used to say, like, oh, thank God I had Frank Giacoia and guys like that inking my work. But the graphic sensibilities were just astounding. Chaikin was the same way. I mean, it's like he really understood the storytelling process visually, but also how to keep the work dynamic and like I said, create a graphic sensibility in the work that just drew the readers right in.
So from studying English and starting a career as a teacher, what was the impetus that sort of then made your life and career, zigzag in a different direction towards comics?
Oh, very simple. I probably had the last teaching deferment in America in the 70s, which meant I didn't get drafted. After my third year, I think, the draft board called me up and said, oh, you've got such a high draft number. You should just volunteer and, you won't get drafted. Which on one hand, I'm going, like, I trust you guys. And on the other hand, it was like, yeah. So, so I turned in my number, didn't get drafted. And after my third year of teaching, I thought, I'd run into Jim Starlin, who was back from the Navy himself. And Jim was working for Marvel. And that made it real for me. I mean, up until that point, the idea of like, I grew up in a factory town in Pontiac, Michigan. The idea that I was going to go and draw comics for a living was like, and then I'm going to go to Los Angeles and become a movie star. It was kind of like, one of those youthful fantasies. But again, from doing fanzines, I think when I was 15 or 16 years old doing Masquerader, I met probably the majority of people I was going to work with in comics over the next decade. That either, professionals who saw my fanzines or people I worked with on the fanzines themselves, like, Len Wein and Marv Wolfman and Milgram, Starlin. I mean, there were so many people there. So that, when I wanted to get into comics myself, that was a real, I had a step in the door already because people at least knew my name. and again, the guys that I worked with, like Starlin and people like that, when I came into New York, they were always very gracious about, like Milgram would always give me a place to stay at his apartment, him and Simonson, and they would say, okay, you want to talk to so and so over at Gold Key this week, or you should check out Charlton, or if you go up to Marvel, make sure you see so and so. So that was a real help in terms of or getting a foot in the door, so to speak.
Let me just go back a little step. What comics were you reading as a kid? Where did you get your comics?
You didn't have to get your comics; they appeared.
Hmm.
I mean, for one thing, you have to understand, when I was a youngster, up until the time I was about 12 or maybe 13, no, about 12, I guess, I didn't have TV. So my mother was a big believer in learn how to read. Every week we went to the library, and I'd get a stack of books, and I would get what I was going to read, and then I'd find like what they used to call the Scribner classics, and they were all illustrated by N.C. Wyeth. So I would sit there with this stack of N.C. Wyeth books and look through those and just like, oh man, this is great. But once I got home, comics were that was the major form of entertainment for kids back in the early 50s. So everybody had a stack of comics that they read and then they passed on. I had an aunt that I would go, we would go visit, and her daughter was my age, and she would literally buy her every issue of their. At the time, there were all the Disney comics. There were, Dell, the Western comics, Archie, Batman and Robin. So I'd leave her house, and I'd have a big stack of comics, like a foot high, and she's like, ah, and so I mean, I would read all of that. My favorites were Classics Illustrated because I loved the stories, and they motivated me to read the book. And when I was about, I guess it was 12 or 13 again, DC started bringing out their revivals of the Flash. I remember seeing the first Flash comic and think, wow, this is really cool, And the comic book came out, and I thought, well, it's nice, but it's not, And then I realized, later I found out like, oh, Joe Kubert inked that first story over Carmine, and he brought a life to it. And when his Hawkman came out, I was like looking at Hawkman, and I would, at the time I had met my friend Fred Jackson, and Fred had told me like, oh yeah, I do my own little homemade comics. So I said, oh, that's cool. Show me how you do that. So we created our own comics, and we trade them back and forth we had a company called Voxen. We would those back and forth. And when I saw Joe Kubert's, Hawkman stuff that he did, Brave and Bold, that's the first thing I looked at, and the germ kind of went into my head of like, oh man, this is what I want to do. I want to draw comics that look like that. Well, I'm still trying, but I mean, that was really what motivated me. But I didn't read the superhero comics were there, but I mean, what I was reading was like I like the mystery comics much better. So I was reading all the like the before Marvel became Marvel, they did all the kind of mystery stuff with. That's where I first discovered Steve Ditko's work.
You're talking about Tales to Astonish,
Right, all
Trinity Mystery,
those books.
The science fiction comics Marvel was doing in the 50s before its superhero revival in 1961.
And there was another company called ACG Comics, American Comics Group, and they put out all these, Adventures into the Unknown and things like that. And I loved reading those.
And those ones, the ACG comics, those have been reprinted in the last 10 years by PS Art Books.
Oh, yeah?
And a few of them have been republished by Dark Horse, but a bunch of them have been published first in hardcover and then in softcover by this small British outfit, PS Art Books.
I have to be a little careful when I find stuff from my youth because, as a kid, it was like, this is so cool. And I look at it now and I'm going like, what's the attraction there? But I loved reading comics because, like I said, they were visual. And like I said, I can remember when I was in 7th or 8th grade, I started if I missed a day of school, I would see Rocky and Bullwinkle, and I would see like the afternoon what they called $1 Million Movie, with the black and white film. And we went to the movies every week. So my what would you want to call it? I don't know if we say inspiration, but it's like movies influenced me probably more than comic books did in terms of okay, this is how I want to tell my stories. So, when I was doing comics, I wanted to do comics that looked like movies. One of the problems that I ran into when I started working was that the only work available for the most part was superhero comics. And I could do them, but they certainly weren't my strength. And in fact, the first stories, when I first started working for Marvel and DC, I think my first two stories for DC were for Joe Orlando's mystery books. Marvel kind of the same way. And then I worked for Gold Key Comics, where, what was it, Twilight Zone and Boris Karloff doing, I think, a handful of stories for them. And the same thing, I worked for Charlton doing mystery stories. The attraction of Charlton was that I could actually ink the work myself. Any of the other companies you work for, they had someone else who would ink the work for you, and they weren't at that. It's like, if anything, my weaknesses really showed up in my inking. So getting work doing that was was more difficult for me.
Mike, so you just referred to cinema being your major influence and not comics, and wanting to think of and reference film in how you drew comics. And this is something that I think a lot of comics people have talked about in different eras. Can you give us an example of what is a comic or a comic artist who does or does not use movies as a primary influence? Because I feel like as a default, people think, well, yeah, comics look like movies. So what's a comic that doesn't look like a movie, or what's something you specifically did to make your comics look like movies?
Well, me, it was more, I guess, what would you call it, osmosis. I just saw enough of them, and I loved them because, going to the movies was a religious experience in my day. Is we'd see, like, on Friday night, we'd see the double feature, which was usually, westerns, Jerry Lewis, the Bowery Boys, things like this. It was not Kurosawa and David Lean. And when you get into the theater, you'd have all, people be sitting there, the lights be on. All of a sudden, the lights would go down, and then there was always a curtain over the screen. And then the curtain would open up, and it was almost like you were being drawn right into that screen. And there were no distractions on either side of you. You were just, the whole time you were just staring at that screen. There was no break. You were transformed for a bit. So, I love that stuff. So when I started drawing comics, it wasn't so much that I'm like, oh, I really want to study, whoever I was looking at. I mentioned David Lean. I really want to study David Lean's movie to see how he tells a story. I didn't even think of that. It was just happening because you watch so much of it. In the same way of, like, reading books taught you about characters, and it was by doing it you were learning, whether you wanted to or not. But I'm thinking of comic strips or whatever that I would say more the daily comic strips are great examples of guys that are less influenced by movies and more just into their own little drawing. I'm trying to think of. I think it's a real subtle difference too, in terms of like I said. I think the guys who are really into the superheroes for the most part probably were less into film, because there weren't a lot of superhero films at the time that were going to move them or teach them or whatever. But I mean, it's of guys. I mean, I can think of the guys off the top of the head who were really influenced by film. Were guys like like Chaykin, Simonson. Geez, who else is in there? Probably Mike Mignola. And whereas like someone Starlin, like Jim Starlin, is probably less influenced by film. Now, you might ask any of those people, and they go, "He doesn't know what he's talking about." Everybody has a different way that they came along. But I mean, just kind of in my general impression, and as I've learned over the years, general impressions often turn to be false. So I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Yes, thank you. That this was not intended to be a trick or a trap. And I'll hand the mic over to Mark, who I think now has a question.
So yeah, we were talking about sort of your background, sort of in underground comics. that being invaluable for networking and kind of getting your name known and recognized. What do you think was the element that sort of got you in the door finally? What was your big break in terms of entering mainstream comics?
They needed an artist that week, and I happened to be in the doorway. Many people ask me over the years, like, how did you get that job? And I'm going, you're in the right place at the right time. And when they hand you the job, you get over that, I don't know how to do this, to, sure, I can take that home and finish it. Like I said, just that youthful arrogance
Mm-hmm.
and I found the same thing true in comics and in animation. As soon as I got my first job, people didn't want your credentials. They were like, oh, he's an old pro. He knows what he's doing. After job one, the same thing I ran in when I started doing working for Marvel Animation. I would come in and talk to them, and they'd go, well, you come out of comics, and God, guys come out of comics, they really don't understand film. And I was like, okay. And so I did some character designs and things like that, Marvel was looking for anybody at the time who could draw storyboards. So I brought stuff in, and the fact that I had done a G.I. Joe comic. I think they looked at my work and they said, well, we'd like to hire you, but you comics guys, you really don't understand film. So if maybe we could hire you as an assistant to somebody, and they can work on the storyboard with you. And it was like, but we don't have anybody available. So maybe you could kind of come in and work on a storyboard, and people here will look at it and go, we don't have a desk available. So here's a script. Take it home, do a storyboard, and come back, and we'll do a lot of, we'll change it and whatever, and talk to you after that. Well, I went home and I did the storyboard. So anyway, I brought the storyboard in, and John Jurwich, who was he was a producer or whatever at the time, looked at it and went, oh, wow, hey, you're hired. So suddenly I had a job storyboarding, and I was on the G.I. Joe team. And the funny thing was, as soon as I got a job storyboarding and my name appeared on the on the union rolls, the places I'd been to 2 weeks before that were looking at my work going, like Hanna-Barbera, and I'm trying to think who else was involved in that time. They were calling up going like, are you free to do any storyboard work? Because animation was just a booming business. This was back in 1985, I think. And it was just like I said, a really great time for animation, but specifically, I did the action adventure type of work, and that's what they were looking for. When I was working in animation, I never wound up doing any of the humor stuff, like Warner Brothers cartoons or anything like that, Ren and Stimpy. In fact, the funniest interview I ever had was I remember this was I'd been around for years doing this stuff, and I had an interview. I saw a guy. What was that at? That was Nickelodeon, and he's looking at my portfolio. He's looking at it. He goes, "Wow, you're really good. You couldn't work for us," And I understood exactly what he was talking about. It's like you're going to be wasted trying to do anything here, and again, doing the comedic work is a different sensibility, and you just kind of have to again, at the time, if I'd been interested, I could have moved toward doing the humor work and really concentrated on that, but it wasn't anything that I was really, attracted to. The same way, like with superhero comics, I could do them, but they weren't. I kind of grew out of that after I was about 13 or 14 in terms of that as kind of a focus. I mean, I certainly never read Marvel comics when I was growing up. Maybe some of the Steve Ditko stuff, but I like Gardner Fox at DC, so I read some of that stuff. But even that, after a year or two, it's kind of like, it wasn't anything that I felt like, oh, I have to make sure I get every issue to continue.
So, Mike, let's differentiate drawing comics and drawing storyboards for animation, and then maybe even drawing storyboards for live action. Drawing a comic, you're focusing on one page at a time. That's the main unit, and you're dealing with sort of left to right and top to bottom. You're leaving space for word balloons. Most of your comics, you have a collaborator, an inker, who's going to finish your artwork, and you are getting a script from someone, and it's a very small team, and you probably have to do a page a day. In animation storyboarding, you are taking an act, like an 11, a 7-minute, 8-minute chunk of a half-hour episode, and you are drawing multiple panels for sort of from moment to moment or shot to shot, and you are drawing arrows for character movement, and you're drawing sort of multiple panels if there's a camera move, and you have to sort of track across a background, and you're dealing with time and dialogue and pacing in a different way than comics, and the team is bigger. Is there anything else that I'm missing, or anything else you want to explain more in these differences?
Joe Kubert once told me one time, he goes, drawing comics is one of the most complicated things you can do because A, you have to draw a tiny little panel that's a perfect illustration, a little picture. And then you've got to draw another one next to it that you can move from A to B and it tells a story. And you're going to do 6 of these on a page. And when you're done, that page has to be a poster in itself so that every piece of it is kind of, a cohesive piece of artwork. And you look at Joe's work and you can really see, like on each page, there's kind of the money shot where that's the big, it's a little, that's what draws your attention to the page. And the other pieces of artwork around it, are form a part of a composition. Now, that's just the art stuff. Like I said, then you have to go like, okay, I have to make sure that I've got, I'm telling the story. I have to keep, I don't want all the characters to be the same size, just talking heads. So you really have to be creative, and it's an interesting process. And again, as Scott McCloud explained in his book, it's like when you go from one panel to the next, it could be infinity. Whereas when you're watching a film, it's all in real time. No.
You're talking about the amount of time that can take place between two panels in a comic. It could be a moment, it could be a minute, it could be an hour, it could be a year.
Yes.
Okay.
And like I said, and the big thing with film is there's another storyboard artist that when I moved out here, I met named Warren Greenwood. And when I started drawing storyboards, I said, Warren, can you teach me a bit about storyboards, how to draw them? And he goes, well, yeah, it'll take about 15 minutes. And I had to laugh because basically, again, I mentioned I was very influenced by film. So I understood that concept of things that were problems. Like the big thing in they pushed in storyboards was like screen direction. If your characters are running from left to right, you don't want to go to the next frame and they're running from right to left. Unless you have to have something in between or whatever. And there were jump cuts. You don't show a guy's close up and then show the next frame he's like 1,000 feet away or whatever. They're little technical things. And again, they used to talk about this as specifics for movies and doing storyboards. But for me, it was basic storytelling common sense. So that when you went from one cell of frame, of a piece of film to one frame of a comic, they were all part of the same kind of this storytelling process that you'd get into. Animation, I remember I got my first job, and I think Marvel, their standard rate then was they were paying $1,000 a week for storyboard artists. And I can remember having my interview with the was it? I can't even remember his name, but anyway, talking about being hired and getting a salary. And I said, well, why don't you pay me $50 less, because you're not going to see me here every day. I said, I'll get the work done, but I find a lot of times just working at home, I can get a lot more done. And he was kind of like, $50, I'll save 50. Great, it works for us. And even when I was working on things like that, I'd go into the office for entertainment. You go in, you see guys, what new books are there out there, and we talk about things. But um, I had to do very little work at the studio. I mean, I would get that done at home. I mean, for one thing, drawing comics taught me how to draw quickly and well, and I didn't second guess myself a lot on what the storyboards, what were happening with them. Again, I like doing it, but it was a job. It wasn't like all my life I've really wanted to do that wasn't it for me. So I mean, I would get the stuff, I would do the work, turn it in, and I wanted to do a good job on it. But I mean, I wasn't one of those guys that stayed around the studio after hours to make sure when the pencil test came in to see what they looked like and to study every frame. That would have made me a much better storyboard artist, but it simply wasn't something that I was that interested in.
There was also was there a shift in the late 80s or in the 90s, or was there a difference between one studio and the next where at Marvel Productions on GI Joe you didn't have to draw the characters perfectly on model in the storyboards? The storyboards were a visual, like cinematic guide for the animators. But I have seen storyboards from other shows later on where every storyboard panel, whatever the angle, whatever the movement or the drawing is, the character, whether it's a funny show or not a funny show, has to be drawn perfectly on model.
Again, depending, I think if you're working more of the, for lack of a better term, cartoony looking shows, the models were more important. One of the oddities of working on GI Joe, we would get back the pencil tests, the finished stuff that you're looking at. I mean, there weren't going to be any changes made from this. And as we watched, we'd go like, "Oh, Warren did that act. Oh, Mike did that act. Oh, Frank Parr did that act." Because they would just take your storyboards, blow them up, and copy them off. So if there was a different drawing style on each one, you could see just from the drawing style who was working on the boards. Just before I stopped working and doing my last animation job, this must have been about 2005, 2006. I remember doing a little bit of work for Marvel, and what they were doing for the rough cut of a storyboard before they'd even send it overseas was more finished looking than the cartoons that we worked on in the 80s. And the other thing is, true to animation is they figured out ways to have you do two jobs and only pay you for one. So storyboarding in this century, you not only had to know how to do a storyboard, you also had to know how to make an animatic out of it, to do the digital work, to turn it into an animatic.
You're talking about timing your storyboard drawings to the audio track.
In other words, they wanted you not only to be a storyboard artist, they wanted you to be the editor too, the director.
Whereas in the 80s, when you were storyboarding for GI Joe, you might write out slugging numbers on your storyboard panel, or someone else would, like how long a shot is going to last based on.
You do a little bit of that.
Okay, but you were doing the drawings, and someone else. I mean, they weren't making animatics for the GI Joe cartoon. That was something that would happen for a much more expensive primetime show like The Simpsons.
The storyboards we're looking at now, after they were done, they were given over to a timing director, and the timing director would figure out, how much time can we spend on this pan, and what dialogue has to be said in that time, and they would coordinate all those things. When I worked for HBO Animation, I had to learn how to do that just as a director. But at first, it's like I discovered, it's like, I'll learn how to do it, but it's not anything I'm very interested in. And kind of the same process happened in live action films. When I moved into that is the Narnia films that I worked on, the director who came out of animation was Andrew Adamson, and he wanted to storyboard the entire film, dialogue included. For a lot of live action artists, they were like, I don't know how to storyboard, dialogue. What do you do with that? And working in animation, I'd learned that process pretty much, or learned tricks to how to approach that. But I mean, in movies, it was like, why would you storyboard, dialogue, and you're going to hand it to Robert De Niro and have him go, "Look, we want you to have this expression when you say this." Be like, we don't work that way. But since the Narnia films were all going to be done with young kids who this is their first time, working in film, having a storyboard that they could look at and kind of relate to was a big help. And it kept me busy working for for a long time too.
While we're talking about the G.I. Joe storyboarding, are you able to sort of give a bit of a sweep as to how long were you working on the Sunbow series? What sort of number of episodes do you think that you actually contributed to the storyboards for?
I don't know, at least 20, maybe more. I know I worked on them for, I think, a little over a year, and you got an act every 2 weeks. So maybe, let's see, probably, like I said, between 20, 30 episodes. I'd have to go back and look.
Mike, I have seen your storyboards for episodes where you do one of the 3 acts and other artists do the other 2 acts. Will Mineo, who worked on the show, recently on Facebook referred to a change where some storyboard artists were allowed to storyboard an entire episode themselves. Does that ring a bell? Was that interesting to you?
Wasn't me.
Okay, was not you.
I think probably Frank and Will, Frank Parr and Will might have done that.
Okay.
I'm trying to think who else was at Marvel at the time. Mitch, but he wasn't working on. He was working on some of the other shows. But if you had aspirations to be a director, you probably could have done an entire show. But I didn't have any aspirations that way. For me, like I said, it was like what I loved about working for storyboarding for Marvel was I could do the job. It never took me more than 20 hours a week to get done what they needed. So I had a lot of free time to like I said, develop drawing, to start trying to figure out how to paint, do things like that. And John Buscema, Al Milgrom told me about a seminar he gave one time where he basically said, learn how to draw better and you can draw faster. And that's what I learned about storyboarding was that knowing how to draw really well, when I did storyboards, I wasn't struggling with drawing. And I would see that with some of the younger guys who would come in. They'd be there working, how do I get the shoe right? How do I do this? And that, like I said, I'd work through those problems in my sketchbooks and things like that. So I didn't have to work at that stuff when I was doing storyboards. I mean, I don't think I ever spent more than 5 to 10 minutes penciling a frame and maybe about the same amount of time, inking it.
Unspoken here, you were a very fast storyboard artist, maybe the fastest one there. Not that it was a competition, but oh no.
Oh, not at all.
Okay. Okay, but this is a little unusual. Who was faster than you?
Oh, geez, Larry Houston,
Okay.
probably Will. I mean, all those guys knew how to turn it out very quickly. I'm trying to think what's the other guys. Oh, geez, there's so many names in there that.
Mineo and Larry Houston had been working in TV animation a few years longer than you had.
Right. I always used to say, as an artist, I saw a lot of guys who could draw better than me. I saw a lot of guys who could draw faster than me. And I saw guys who could work cheaper than me. But I didn't meet a lot of guys who could do all 3 together. It was you're affected somewhat by the job in terms of like, okay, what are they paying me? What do they want done? For me, I wasn't, like I said, I hadn't worked my whole life so that I can do G.I. Joe storyboards now. Like I said, I liked the job, but it was like, okay, what's next?
I think I heard a quote from you, which was said something along the lines of they asked what was the hardest part of the job, and you said something like not letting the boss know that you'd finished.
I mean, it was
because I guess
it was.
then you get given more work to do for the same amount of money.
Yep. When I was in college, I worked one summer for making buses for GM, and they gave you a 40-minute cycle. And when you finish that 40-minute cycle, if you finished it ahead of time, which, if you knew the job, you could do it easily, you couldn't read a book. That if you're reading a book, then they were going to combine and assign you more work. What I thought was interesting was, you could go into the John and there was a whole bookshelf there with stuff on it to read. Of course, the only thing to read were plan literature. And it was like that was the big reading material when you went into the John. You could read all the Klan literature that was out there. So
Mark was gonna Mark was gonna
Yikes.
ask about G.I. Joe the movie.
Yeah, before I get onto that, I had an Easter egg, which was I was just going to ask you about. There's this character, Bon Appetit, from the episode Raise the Flag, and I understand that might have been based on you. Is
me,
that?
do I look like that character?
Is this a true story, or is this a bit
Sitting
apocryphal?
in Sam Weiss's office, who was the director on this episode, and we were talking about it. He goes, okay, and then there's this character who's, I think he's been on the sub or whatever for, as a, stranded there for 3 years or whatever, and he looks kind of like bedraggled, and he's just like he's worn out, and he goes, he kind of looks like Mike, and so went from that into this storyboard there, and I know when I was at HBO, I was also played the demented priest in one of the episodes.
You're talking about Spawn.
It's Spawn, yeah, and I think it might have been a priest in one of the G.I. Joe episodes too, for some reason. But see, that was the other thing they did too. Was like, okay, we don't have to pay somebody to do a character. Just what do you think that character should look like? And you give them a little drawing, and it's like, great. Now we don't have to pay the character artist for it. And like for the guys, it was like, oh, this is really cool because I get to design the characters that I want in this thing. So I guess it was a win-win situation. But you'd often get scripts and you go like, well, this just came in, it's due, and we haven't had time to send it to to have anybody do the characters yet. So just draw the characters the way you think they should be, and we'll use that.
I have seen, Mike, I have seen your storyboard for The Spy Who Rooked Me, 1985 episode with a James Bond stand-in. And in the storyboard, the spy looks like sort of anyone, does not match the final model the way that the character is animated in the final episode. And that strikes me as an example where when you are storyboarding from that script, that character has not yet been designed yet, or the design has not yet been approved.
Right.
Because presumably that approval has to go from Marvel in Los Angeles to Marvel to Sunbow in Los Angeles to Sunbow in New York, and then back again. That might take 2 days or a week or something like that.
I mean, the guys who did characters for us at when I worked on the G.I. Joe series, there was Russ Heath, and then there was another artist named Glenn Vilpo, who is famous out here for being the best figure drawing teacher, in the Los Angeles area there. And by the way, one of my advantages, how I wound up working on G.I. Joe, was an old comic connection. Was I had finished doing a series with Christy Marks at the time called Sisterhood of Steel. Well, of course, Christy was the kind of the head writer, the lead writer at Sunbow at the time. So she also would, like, oh, you want to talk with so-and-so? Okay, make sure you talk to these people or whatever. And so, like I said, there were all these connections really helped.
So we were about to ask about the G.I. Joe movie. So can you tell us about your memories of working on that? And one of the questions I had was working on the G.I. Joe movie, did it feel very different to just working on the regular series?
Well, again, this is 40 years ago, and what I can tell you is that they did a G.I. Joe movie. I did some work on it, but I mean, it was like a few fill-in frames here and there.
Uh-huh.
I think I was working with Frank on that, Frank Parr. I'm not sure if he was director or.
So my understanding of the storyboarding credits for the movie is that 3 or 4 people boarded the movie, some of them as roughs. So were you finishing Frank Parr's roughs? Were you plussing them?
Let me get in my time machine and I'll go back and I'll check on that one for you.
Okay. For those just listening, not watching the episode,
Yeah.
Mike shook his head as if to say, I can't quite remember.
Well, I mean, at the time it was like, okay, I got another storyboarding job for the week. This one's going to be in the movie. But for me, I didn't make that differential so much as like, all right, this is what I'm doing this week.
Hmm.
It was like, how are you going to use it? That's they were getting ready to send out, one of the episodes or whatever, and Jim Graziano, who was the producer or whatever, was going like, "Come on, we got to get this stuff done, on the direct to Japan in the next hour." And he goes, "Well, our guys are working on it, and we're trying to." And he goes, "Doesn't have to be that good, just has to weigh this much." And I thought, that kind of wraps up my my attitude about like working in animation at the time.
Can you clarify that reference, that joke? When you say it just has to weigh this much, you're talking about shipping something to Japan? You're talking about like the weight of film, like feet and frames of
They
film.
were going to send like maybe 2 pounds of storyboards. Well, they weren't concerned whether that was 2x or whatever. Every week we send 2 pounds. So scribble something on some more pages, and as long as it's 2 pounds, we fulfilled our contract. I mean,
Okay.
it was that kind of thing. And Jim was the one who also, when I asked him for $50 less, went, "Yeah, you're hired." So um, um,
Jim Graziano and his wife Stephanie founded Graz Entertainment, which was the studio responsible for Fox's 90s X-Men cartoon.
okay, and I worked. God, I think they were called BTN at the time when I worked with them, and I can't even remember what I was working on. So again, that was that year's job. It's I don't go back and look at you know the commercial comic books I used to work on, and I I I'm not sure that I've even seen a lot of the storyboards that I did in animation. I did. It wasn't like I watched those episodes religiously when they came out, and the Spawn stuff I saw just because there was less of it. But the only thing I go back and look at from time to time are like my own creator-owned comics.
This is a good little segue, Mike. When I interviewed you in 2005, and you said to be professional, you don't have to be a fan; you just have to be professional. And if I can draw and if I can storyboard, if I can make the deadline, it doesn't matter whether I or anyone else really likes the property. And I think of that sometimes when like actors do press interviews or they go to
Uh-huh.
Comic-Con for like the new comic book movie, and it's like, oh, Robert Downey Jr., did you read Iron Man comics or do you love Marvel comics? And we sort of hope the answer is yes, but it should all be in the screenplay and in his preparation, and that shouldn't be a barrier for entry. And I think there are some comics professionals out there who are fans, and I think sometimes they're slower because they're like spending some of their time and energy like absorbing other work and some of the work that they have done. And I think about this idea that like a professional soccer player, it's like, do you watch a lot of soccer on TV? It's like, no, I'm playing soccer, right? It's like Mike Vosberg, like, do you love GI Joe many years later? Like, it was a good job, but I draw stuff and I write stuff. I think about this sort of division a lot.
Well, I mean, one of the things when I was working on Spawn, I had the best boss in the world with Catherine Winder. She was like an excellent people person, and I remember telling her, I said, "Look, I have absolutely no affinity for the Spawn character." I said, "However, that won't stop me from doing the best job available, for you." And she was kind of like, I said, one of the problems you're going to run into with fans is kind of what you discovered is like, you know, they're working on Spawn and they get a script and they're going, "Wait a minute, they changed this. I don't like what they're doing. I'm going to sit around and pout all day." And it's like, I didn't have any of those problems. It was like, this is the script they've given me. It's my job to do the best job possible to make it work. And if it doesn't look exactly like the Spawn comic or whatever, that's not my concern. And I think being a fan helps in a certain. I mean, certainly for me, if I'd been more of a fan of the superhero comics, I could have had maybe a better career at Marvel. But I still it's like you still did a professional job on it, and it's like I said, it's like with professionals, you get a good job and you get it turned in when it's needed. I mean, that's the thing is all of this stuff. It doesn't matter if you create something that looks like the drawings like Michelangelo and the stories like Shakespeare, but you got it in on a Tuesday and they needed it the Friday before, you failed because they can't use it. So I mean, it's time and your deadlines are, I would say, more important than the quality of the work. And you certainly want to you want to bring quality to the work, but the reality also is that like I said, it has to be in on a deadline.
Mike, since you mentioned how much you got paid as a storyboard artist at Marvel Productions on the G.I. Joe cartoon, may I ask how much your page rate was at Marvel in the 70s and the 80s, if you can remember?
Well, you have to remember at the time when I was in high school, my dad was a janitor. I don't think he ever made more than $100 to $150 a week, and on that he, fed a family, raised a family of four and put four kids through college on $100 a week. So when I go into the 70s and I go, what did I get paid? I remember getting, like $1,000 to work for Marvel was like, wow. I was like, I'm rich. And, when I worked for HBO, it was like, they doubled that. So, I mean, and again, it's kind of like you're worth whatever the work can, whatever you can get for the work. You never consider yourself overpaid. So,
And on G.I. Joe in like 83 or so, that wasn't that around about the time that Jim Shooter instituted the royalties scheme at Marvel, which was, I guess, driven by the actual number of copies sold of any given comic. So G.I. Joe was quite a high selling comic out of the Marvel outputs. How much of a kind of a component of this, the gig was the fact that it was giving you royalties?
That was certainly a big plus, because I think probably in those days I got $50 for layouts on a page. And again, so the royalties oftentimes would like double whatever you were making on the comic. I do remember on G.I. Joe, I bought my first car just on the royalty payments. So they were probably, maybe $1,000 an issue, something like that. And depending on who was reprinting them, years later, you were still getting, payments for them. Then you'd run into people like, who was it?
IDW.
IDW going, we're only doing these books for the fans. We're not making any money on them. We can't pay you royalties. And, as a professional, I'm going, if you're not making money and you can't pay the people, you shouldn't be doing the product. And their response is always like, well, do you have a contract on that? And no, but I mean, it's like, I certainly would never do any work for a company like that.
When you were drawing for Marvel in the 70s and 80s, where did you live?
First started working on comics, I was living in Battle Creek,
Michigan.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were FedExing your art to Marvel in New York,
right?
And then did you move to New York?
No, I never. I visited New York, but I never lived there. I'm like I said, I did all my original Marvel work. I did in comics. I did in Detroit, and then I moved to Battle Creek. And I remember at the time I was, going through a divorce, and I always thought people must have thought I was a secret agent, because I would just wander out from my apartment and I'd wander down to the library to find the latest books on Russian weapons and whatever, and then check them out and go back to my apartment and hide up there. So I'm sure somewhere in the FBI files are probably still checking out to see who this guy was. It was
So when you got hired at Marvel Productions in 85, let's say early 85, that's when you moved from
Right.
Michigan to Los Angeles.
Annie and I, we were together in South Bend. We got married and then came out here. Never going back.
But so you weren't in New York, but I guess a lot of people of that era found it useful being there, being able to be in the office, such that when they were like, who can draw this? Oh, you, the guy that's standing over there. It could be an advantage.
That's definitely like if it's like you've got work needs to be done on a Friday afternoon, and you're in the office there. You can you can schmooze with people. I mean, quite honestly, if I hadn't moved to LA, my career as an artist might well have been over because Shooter had already kind of put out um, uh, the purge of any artist that he didn't think worked well with Marvel, and I was certainly one of them. And so like I said, in terms of comics, it would have been tough going. So being in Los Angeles and moving into film and things like that, it's like that opened up the whole new field.
I heard that you made a good impression on Jim Shooter when you first were starting at Marvel, and he asked you about who you'd like to be inked by.
That I had no idea. One of the reasons I left Marvel was Vinnie Coletta used to ink my work, and let me say here, he did a good job of it considering what I was giving him. I mean, again, I didn't know anything about drawing. The drawings were well done, but they weren't anything special. And Vinny would really give them a nice slickness. He really, he did a good job on them. But what I tried to explain to Vinny and he didn't understand was I'm getting better, but the work isn't getting any better. I my goal is I eventually want to ink this stuff myself. So, I don't even know if I don't think I had a contract with DC at the time, but I just, Marvel approached me about signing a contract, and I said, "Oh, sure, it's time for a change again," because you hopscotch back and forth between companies a lot. So, so I started working at Marvel, and and came in and met Jim because he was working on this project called Team America, and he explained it to me, and this like and yeah, well, that sounds interesting. He goes, "Well, who would you like to ink it?" And I had no idea at the time that the new art director who'd come over for Marvel was Vinny, and he and Jim were like best buddies, And when he asked me that, I immediately blurted out, "Well, anybody but Vinny." And his face just fell, and the other people in the room, their faces kind of like. And when the book came out, of course, Vinny was inking it, but the second part of that was I brought the job in specifically to show to Jim, showed it to him. He looked, "Oh yeah, this looks good, this looks good." And then on the Friday night when it was due on Monday, I wasn't again talking about being in New York. How does this affect your career? I'm in Battle Creek someplace working on this stuff. The store, the job comes in. Jim's had the job there for a month. All of a sudden, he looks on that Friday and he goes, "We can't use this. This is all done wrong." And of course, he brings in a whole crew of I think there's Bob Layton and Larry Hama and whoever was around the office. Like, okay, let's re-ink this, let's redo this, and that was pretty much the end of my my Marvel career. And I was given the GI Joe project, I think, as a slap on the wrist for not doing a good job on his Team America or whatever. It's like let's give you GI Joe because nobody really wants to draw that because it wasn't a fan book. So like I said, it was. But again, for me, it was like, okay, it's one more job.
It's not a fan book. By that, you're meaning that the audience for the GI Joe comic is a different audience to the rest of Marvel.
No, what I'm saying wasn't a comic book fan. In other words, like I would get my artwork back from GI Joe, and I would go to a comic convention. I couldn't give it away. I mean, it's like if I tried to sell it for $5, I might sell one page. So I mean, a lot of the artwork when I gave it to like kids in the neighborhood or gave it away to people because when the book came out, it had no intrinsic value because the readers for GI Joe were all under 12 years old. They weren't going to to Comic-Con to find the art. And and I look now when I go on eBay or wherever and I find a GI Joe page selling for $2,000 to $4,000 whatever, and I'm thinking, oh no.
Mike, is there a contrast here? Because before you drew GI Joe, you drew She-Hulk. So if you went to a convention with your She-Hulk pages, there was interest in those?
Um, yes, but not a lot. Not, but in other words, like I worked on an episode. I did a what do they call those? A quarterly or whatever special of X-Men.
An annual. You drew an X-Men annual.
Yeah, an annual, whatever. And when I got the artwork for that, it sold very quickly and very well. So I mean, it's like usually in those days you were selling art for somewhere between $25 and $40 a page, and it was like it was ancillary income to doing the work.
Yeah, funny enough, back in the day, because I'm based in the UK, we missed your run of G.I. Joe, the first run round, because it wasn't printed in the UK, and it didn't. When we saw it, it sort of started in the mid-20s. So I was less familiar with your G.I. Joe work until I discovered it a little bit later on, sort of after it had come out. And so when you came to a UK convention, what I knew you for was for X-Men. So it says for Peter, which is my brother. So we were like, well, he drew that X-Men annual, and he drew a really cool Wolverine. So why don't we why don't we ask if we can get a Wolverine sketch?
I'll just jump back a moment when, Mike, you were describing Jim Shooter having a last minute rewrite of an issue. Shooter is a little bit known for that. Like the final issue of the original Secret Wars had a last minute sort of like midnight redraw, reworking, rescripting, and Elliot R. Brown has a post about that on his website, including a couple photos of some artists like hurriedly sort of redrawing and correcting issue 12 of Secret Wars.
And I think I thank Jim profusely for the effect he had on my career, because once he kind of pushed me out of Marvel Comics, I wound up in Los Angeles. I wound up doing storyboard artists. I wound up working storyboards for film. I wound up doing Tales from the Crypt. None of that probably would have been possible without Jim's part. So, it's
there was a lot of framed artwork in your home, and some of it is your art, and some of it I don't mean just the room that we can see right now, your studio, but your home. Some of it is yours, and some of it is artists who you admire. And some of the work that you have done is you drawing or painting in the style of artists you admire. And I think sometimes comics fans, and even me included, get a little tunnel vision for only comics artists without remembering the wider world of illustration and illustration history. Can you speak to a few artists outside of comics who have impacted you and whose work you like to talk about and emulate?
Oh, it's endless. I mean, when I worked with Chaykin, he really introduced me to the famous illustrators. Which actually there's something called the Famous Illustrators course, which were done by all the the classic illustrators. Norman Rockwell started, and some of his contemporaries started the school. So I mean, when I was growing up, the only illustrators I knew were N.C. Wyeth and Hirschfield, who did the characters for Broadway plays, and Bob Peak, because Bob Peak also did a lot of work for. He did like the movie posters for My Fair Lady and Camelot, and so I was familiar with that work. And then I noticed this great work on these. I used to go to the paperback stuff, and I would see these books with this artist that drew just the most stunning women in the world, named Bob McGinnis. So I mean, I was familiar with his work, and I thought this guy really draws beautiful women. And then I discovered some of his work in post and went, oh my God, he draws everything as well that way. The big guy that Chaykin introduced me to was Robert Fawcett and Austin Briggs. Who else was in there? I'm trying to think. Milton Caniff's partner there, Noel Sickles. When I looked at their work, what struck me was, the guys that I really admired in comics were Joe Kubert, Leonard Starr, who did On Stage, Wally Wood, Alex Toth. I'm sure there's lots of others than that, but like those were the guys. And when I looked at the famous illustrators, I realized, like, oh my God, these were the guys that that my favorite comic book artists, that's who they were looking at. So I mean, at that point, it's one of the things I admired about Kubert was that he didn't stand still. He learned how he created a style in the 40s, and when he got to the 50s, he changed that style. He moved from just doing like simple line work to an illustrative style, and and he continued to evolve even as later in his career. And one of the things I did that about comics was that usually people learn how to draw something well, and then you know flatlined at that point. They continue to stay that way. So like for better or for worse, I admire guys like Frank Miller who continually changed and evolved as he was doing work. On the other hand, then you have someone like Leonard Starr who did on stage, and from day one he was brilliant, and when he left that to do Annie, he was still brilliant. But I don't think that he ever went kind of beyond that, because it's like, okay, this is the strip, and this is what they're looking for. I mean, I've never seen any of Leonard's illustration that he did that was what's in his home, but I've had other people tell me like, oh, he's a wonderful painter or whatever. And it's like with me, I taught myself how to paint, not to sell paintings, but to force myself to get better as an artist. When I was working with Chaikin, we did a year of American Flag, and he wanted me to use craft tint, which is this board where it's got two chemicals on it. You can do a one chemical and it gives you light, another chemical gives you dark. So it's kind of like you can get that dot pattern right on the paper. What it did for me was it forced me to learn how to draw three-dimensionally. When I was working in the underground comics, I remember sending some work to Richard Corbin, and he sent it back, and for an underground, he wasn't using it, but he said, I think one of the problems you're having is you haven't really made up your mind yet whether you're trying to do a flat poster, approach to the artwork, or to create the illusion of a three-dimensional, round figure. And I mean, I rarely got art advice from any editors other than maybe Joe Orlando. But when Corbin told me that, it was like a light went off in my head. It was like, oh my God, it's so and his other advice was like, draw as much from life as possible. And so I tried to incorporate those two things. And when I started working on the craft tint, it forced you to draw, a tonal pattern three-dimensionally. You weren't just creating an outline of the character and leaving it that way. You had to create the character, in a lighted interior where you could see the space behind them. And like I said, you were creating a three-dimensional approach to the work. So I mean, those were all part of the and painting was the same way. Painting, you couldn't take a painting and just do a piece of line work. It had to be characters in space, and you really believed the space between them and things around them. And I mean, and like every Sunday for past 30 years, I've been going to Bill Stout puts on a life drawing workshop here in Los Angeles. So, been going to that every Sunday for 30 years. And again, that's what those sketchbooks are. And it's a continual process of, if you're not moving forward, you're out of it. So.
And speaking of moving forward, I'm going to drag us back into 1983, I'm afraid. And you produced for the issue 200 of G.I. Joe, you did a few of these sketch covers, and on this particular one that I've put on screen, I think this is Herb Trimpe.
That's Herb in the foreground and me in the background.
Yeah, so he's saying, settle down, guys, give this new guy a chance, because of course, Herb was very much the artist for the first year of G.I. Joe, and you came in for year, the second year, and what I sort of almost think of as the season 2 of the G.I. Joe comic, because it was very much that phase of shifting from the those army guys in green into this sort of more colourful cast of characters in the era that you were working on. which lasted a year and change. A good few issues that you worked on: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 there in all. And your first one was issue 9, written by Stephen Grant, a story called The Diplomat. So it was a bit of an oddity in terms of it being written by Stephen Grant rather than Harmer. Do you remember what was involved in producing that issue? Was it potentially created as an inventory issue
Yes.
or a tryout issue?
Yes, because I think they knew Herb was leaving, so they wanted to have something ready. So I think I did 9, somebody else did 10, and then I think I did 11. Ran through most of those. I think Larry did the great silent one.
Mm-hmm. So was it a case of giving you that first one as a tryout? They saw that you'd done a good job on it, and then were confident to see that you were a good fit for the title and offer you the job as the permanent job?
At the time, I had a contract with Marvel, so they had to give me a certain amount of work, and that was one of the things that Shooter was desperately trying to do was, how do I get rid of all these contracts with these guys?
Right.
So I'm sure it was like the G.I. Joe book was like, oh great, we got to give them something. Let's give them this. And apparently, like I said, apparently they were happy with it. And I did more issues. I had real reservations about the book because coming out of the Vietnam era,
Mm-hmm.
the last thing I wanted to do is create a war book. And they, continually tell me it's about secret agents. It's about, okay. But so, like I said, when I took over, it was like, it's a job. But again, and the same approach that I took was, it's a job, but I'm going to do it as the best work that I can possibly do on it. And one of my frustrations, as always working in comics, was I would turn into pencils and I would see the finished book and I'd feel so deflated, like, wait a minute, none of it, it's just like it didn't live up to it. I'm sure part of it was my fault, but again, as my drawing improved, the inking never improved on the book. So
I've got a quote from you, Mike. The first couple of issues I did were inked by Chick Stone, and I liked his stuff a lot, but he got booted off the project because he wasn't a nut and bolt fanatic. If he's doing a gun, he did a reasonable facsimile of a gun. And with Larry, that wasn't going to work. It was like, no, you haven't got the safety on that side. So this is where then John D'Agostino is inking the book, and you didn't love his inking on the book.
No. On the other hand, if I'd been publisher of the book, I would have went, why would we get rid of him? He's got none of these clicks, leans. It was like he was producing exactly the kind of book that a 10-year-old kid would want to read. My problem with it was, is I wanted to. There weren't the subtleties in it that I was looking for. I mean, and it was. I had all the different characters. I would have a different movie star who was playing them. So I'd be drawing, a likeness of the characters. Like Dr. Venom was Peter Cushing, and I think, Hawk was like Burt Lancaster and things like that. So I'd spend time working on the faces, and then I'd get the book, and it'd be the same, eye, nose, 3 lines for the cheekbone type of thing. It was just like, it was a frustration for me in terms of but I want to move forward with this stuff, and it wasn't happening that way. So, but John was producing exactly what they needed, and he understood the hardware, which was what made Jim happy, and drew it that way.
Can I ask if there were any other particular characters that were inspired by likenesses? For example, like Scala or CoverGirl, did you have particular actresses in mind? Or?
Once again, I'd have to get back in my time machine, and I'm sure I did, who they were at the time. And the other thing with G.I. Joe was like someone would show up, he'd be in 2 frames, and he'd move on. And it's like, you just getting their uniforms was far more important than creating an individual character for them. So
and you Harmer obviously wrote all but one of the issues that you worked on. What was the experience of working with Harmer? Did you interact directly very much, or was it a case of just receiving the plot in the post?
We didn't interact a lot, but the best two writers I worked with in comics were Chaykin and Hama, because they were artists and they would give you a script where they understood what happened in each frame. Nothing was worse than getting scripts where, panel 1, Batman is talking. Panel 2, Batman jumps into the room, takes the secret plans, hits the guy, and knocks over a chair and runs out of the room. And I'm going, okay, that's about 4 panels. And it's like working with writers who didn't have a good visual sense was always a problem. Whereas, like I said, Larry and Howard were both that way. Terry Austin, same thing, as an artist. Christie wasn't an artist, but she had the best sensibilities in terms of who the people were and how to manipulate them in a story.
Did you ever get much feedback from Harmer? Did he send you lots of references, or was it a case that you had to go and scout? You mentioned going to the library, digging out spy material.
I was the most popular uncle in the world because I had every G.I. Joe toy, because anything new that came out, they sent it to me. So had all the little action dolls. I had all the toys, the guns, whatever. And so, I would use that for reference. And also, in a script, Larry would specifically tell you, like, he's using a Luger, or in this case, he's using it was James Bond gun.
Walther PK.
Exactly. So, you're looking for like the gun that Quinn's holding in this thing. I remember it was like this 50 millimeter machine gun that usually it took 2 guys to carry it around. And so I had to, I remember getting the book on weapons from the Battle Creek Library and getting reference on that and using it. So, and by the way, Quinn was a fun character to draw. I liked him. I liked certainly the Baroness and Destro.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not military characters, because they're spy characters or James Bond characters, right? Or adventure characters, or because
they were fun
because their costumes are more flamboyant. Because Baroness is a sexy character. These are can I try and fill in some of the answer there?
Yeah, he's kind of like Mrs. Peel with glasses on. But it's like the other characters. There are just so many of them, and they all have their own little gimmick. Again, it's like when the books would come in, I really enjoyed, or I should say, they taught me a lot about storytelling, working with Larry on them, in terms of what to put in and what you can keep. And Larry never gave me a hard time about that at all. I remember asking him one time, I was like, well, what can I do that you think would make it better? And he kind of pondered, like, He goes, I think maybe your I guess what would you call it, spatial awareness, in terms of, this is the size of the actual tank, this is the guy walking beside it. It was like, okay. But he was, I remember years later talking to Larry, I'm going, like, God, I thought you hated my work because you never said anything about it. And he said, well, I said, I came out of an industry where I worked for Wally Wood, and Wally never told you if anything good. He just told you what was bad and needed to be changed. And so I thought that's kind of the same approach that that Larry took with me, that he learned from Wally Wood, was it all works, so just leave it there. And if you look at the top of that frame, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. I was trying to really get character into all those faces, and I didn't see it in the finished work. Did that make it better? No, I'm not sure that it did. But it was frustrating for me.
And on some issues, you were credited as being penciler and inker, and sometimes it was breakdowns and finishes. I'm assuming that that's a case of the latter being a little less polished and giving more to the inker to do, because I guess you've got to do it more quickly. Was there much difference in approach between the two?
I was very naive at the time, and to get around the tight pencil, because basically what they were looking for in tight pencils were a page that was inked with a pencil, and then you were going to just trace that off. And
Mhm.
what I was trying to do in the pencils was to create, when you say the word finished, these are completely finished, but you're going to have to make some decisions in terms of, how am I going to handle the rendering here, whatever. But I mean, the line work, the shading, it's all there. And a lot of other editors would have looked at this and like, well, you're doing finished work, and we can pass it on to whoever, and they can finish it. I mean, for example, one of the guys that used to drive inkers crazy was Gene Colan, because he would do these beautiful pencils.
Can I jump in, Mike? You're describing that in Colin's penciling, a lot was left up to interpretation because of how he drew and described with a pencil, right? Because you'd almost want to ink it with a wash, but
Exactly.
you
I
couldn't.
guess that's what I'm saying, is that the work was beautifully done, but there were gray areas. And so you had to figure out, how am I going to handle that gray area? So you get a guy like Tom Palmer, who's an excellent draftsman and artist in his own right, and he knows exactly what to do with those gray areas, how to, what kind of rendering comes in, how to take it to the, to keep the subtleties that Gene Colan had, but at the same time, make it work in print and take it from there. And where there were a lot of inkers who would have had a horrible time trying to figure out Gene Colan's work. In fact, I would hear stories, from older guys talking about, like, oh God, we always hated Ink Gene's work, because it was like, how do you translate a lot of the grays that he's doing into black? And in reverse, it's like, you know, as great as Tom Palmer was, I think he inked a couple of Simonson stories, and I thought, oh, I never thought the combination worked, because Walt's work is so linear and so clean that way, and Tom Palmer kind of took it in another direction.
So getting back to Mark's question about pencils or breakdowns, were you going to say that doing breakdowns was a way to put a little less into it if the inker wasn't going to do what you wanted?
No, basically, breakdowns were a way for Marvel to pay me $5 less a page. That was
Okay.
just a term. It's like, if it's like, as breakdowns, if I didn't get the wrinkle right on a sleeve, hey, it's a breakdown. So it again, what I was doing with breakdowns, I can think of, would be in so many cases you would turn in, and people would think like, these are finished pencils, and it's certainly, you could, it's like, you get to an artist like Joe Kubert, and he would never do anything farther than this for his pencils, because it's like, no, I've got the substance of what I want there. It's just a matter of, how am I going to do finishes, and the reality always is, when you're penciling a page, you're working in gray, and that gray has to be translated into black. And that's, like I said, guys like Wally Wood or Joe Kubert or Frank Giacoya, any number you can think of, they would come in and take that work and turn out these beautiful finishes. But if you weren't well versed in simply the art of drawing and designing, all you were doing is trying to trace this stuff, and you didn't want to have to think about it. And that, like I said, that's always the process. I mean, when I pencil for myself, I would never think of taking anything that tight, because the process of turning it into a finished piece of artwork happens as much in the inking process as it does in the penciling. So I mean, and storytelling. I think that's the biggest thing, is like, as an inker, how am I going to take this to add to the story? So, and I mean, a lot of what I'm saying is pretty, I guess, esoteric in terms of like, well, what is he talking about? Um, but it's part, like I said, it's part of that process of, how do you take things and make them really fascinating.
There have been some examples here and there in like How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, or in the DC Comics Guide to Inking, or like the DC Currents sort of news page in the 90s, or like the Marvel bullpen page. There've been examples where an editor shows the same panel inked or the same page inked by 3 different inkers.
Uh-huh.
And I've always found that really interesting and helpful. It's like, oh, well, this inker interpreted this sort of squiggly line in a sort of more triangular way. This inker used a pen. This inker used a brush. This line in this case turned out sort of the difference between the thick and the thin is much more pronounced, whereas this other inker sort of more traced the line, or, this line, every line now is like 0.5 millimeter thicker because this inker just has a heavier hand.
Right.
And so some of what you're describing is esoteric, but I do think Mark and I appreciate the level of detail, and we do like looking at the differences and the potential in the pencils.
I guess I can explain this best in terms of the audience for the G.I. Joe books, like I said, was under 10 years old, under 12 years old. I mean, they might have readers above that, but basically it was comic for young boys. At the same time, DC was turning out Joe's Sergeant Rock. Sergeant Rock wasn't designed for 10-year-old kids. And I mean, I look at like how Joe used to handle the artwork on that, and that's what I wanted to do. But I think if I would have been, trying to do that on G.I. Joe, it probably would have hurt the readership a bit. It's you kind of need to fit people into certain spaces and do them that way.
So Denny O'Neil was the editor of G.I. Joe during your run. Harmer was also an editor, but was the credited writer rather than editor for G.I. Joe. So what was the kind of the process of working with Denny O'Neil on G.I. Joe specifically? What sort of editorial relationship was that like?
Oh, it's pretty simple. I've got my favorite books I want to work on. Leave me alone and don't bother me, and just do it, get this turned in. At the respect that I had for Larry in terms of the quality he put into the work, I don't think Denny ever did anything but rubber stamp stuff. I remember doing one book for him and sending him a thing like where there was like a dialogue balloon that didn't fit in the right place. And when I sent it back, I said, you want to make sure this is done or whatever. Of course, the book came out and, nothing happened to it. But I mean, that was, like my experience. I had decided to leave G.I. Joe, and Russ Heath was going to ink an issue. And about, 2 weeks before it was due, I get this frantic call from Denny going like, Mike, Russ has never turned in a book. Could you, rough pencil a book for us, quickly? So, which I did. And he said, but he said, we can't give you a better rate, but the royalties on this book was going to give you a good chunk of cash. I went, okay, great. So I spent a couple of weeks. I penciled the book up. It's lying in the Marvel files or someplace. I don't know where. And, it's great. Book comes out. It's got Russ's story in it. He turned it in at the last minute. I didn't get a single call from Denny or his assistant or whoever going like, hey, Mike, we were in a situation where the book was actually turned in. So that royalty we promised you, you're not going to get. That's the kind of thing that I those kind of things annoyed me more than anything else.
Yeah, this was issue 24, the one issue that Russ Heath had in print for.
And what really pissed me off was that Russ did such a beautiful job on it, and I couldn't even complain. God, it was great stuff.
It must have been fascinating seeing what he did after you'd been working on it for such a long time to be able to compare and contrast and see how another artist's mind interprets the same material.
What was fascinating too was I was working with Russ at the time, probably at the G.I. Joe Animation, and I don't think we ever even talked about that or whatever. It's like, hey, it's kind of funny.
And speaking about issues that you didn't do, you did a huge chunk of this run, but there were a couple of issues that you didn't work on. So issues 20 and 21 1. Do you have any recollections as to why what happened that meant that you didn't work on those 2 specific issues?
All I knew was that I saw that issue that Hama did, where it was like the silent issue. Thought, you bastard! I've got to follow this. It was just like I said, that was like a brilliant piece of work there.
Could we so you're the regular artist and you had drawn the 3 previous issues at least. So can we assume that there was some reasonable snag in the schedule with, Marvel getting approvals from Hasbro, or scheduling another fill-in issue because one of those issues is another Stephen Grant script, or that with your Marvel contract, because you weren't just drawing G.I. Joe in 1983, that there was some other things at Marvel that was more important, such that maybe you had a specific skip month on G.I. Joe? I'm sort of just guessing here.
I don't think I ever did anything for Marvel other than G.I. Joe for that year or whatever I worked on. I mean,
Okay.
I know I did a, what's the other one? Transformers issues, but that was more, yeah, like I said, that's pretty much all I can remember. I think I remember after G.I. Joe, I started working with Christie on Sisterhood of Steel. So I think that's probably why I left it.
Yeah, I guess you're right. I've got a chronological list of your G.I. Joe year, and What If, and the Team America, What If fill-in, an Iron Man issue, a Micronauts issue. Those come before your year on G.I. Joe, and then Sisterhood of Steel is published after. So yes, I misspoke. It seems like you were only on G.I. Joe the year that you were on G.I. Joe.
Yeah, reading 22, the issue that follows the Hama's Silent interlude issue, it feels particularly is this a word? Expository. Lots of expositional word balloons, which sort of makes you think that perhaps the issue had been drawn ahead of 21, and potentially the word balloons are being edited to catch up with what had happened in the issue 21, so that kind of it still made sense that they're referring to this event that isn't really quite so connected to the rest of the issue.
I'm looking at that issue now, and I have no idea. I mean, for me, it was just like probably at the time, I was looking at it in terms of, oh God, I get a break this month from from doing GI Joe, and so I mean, for me, it was more like combat fatigue, because when you're doing this book, every issue there were new characters, there were new machinery. It was not an easy process. You remember on issue 22 all the research I did on the Kennedy funeral.
Okay.
Oh, for Flag's funeral.
This is for Flag's funeral.
Yeah, but I mean, for research, what I used was what the JFK's funeral and what it looked like and that.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, because there's definitely a lot of very specific, accurate military kind of convention to the to that funeral, and the way it's laid out, the where people are standing, all of that kind of stuff. It looks researched.
Believe me, it was.
Mark, should I do my non-G.I. Joe question, or do you have another one?
What was my other question? Oh, my other question was that a couple of the issues that you worked on in your run specifically featured as TV adverts. So issue 11, The Pipeline Ploy, I believe, had a TV advert advertising that comic. And I know that the production schedule around those worked a little bit different to a normal comic, in that I think Hama would create the cover so that they had the cover to share on screen, and then kind of work back from there. From your perspective, did those TV advert, TV commercial issues feel any different to any other issue?
Probably they brought me more royalties, but other than that, again, I think I keep going back to this. Is like, okay, this is a script. This is what I'm going to do this month. And you start working on it. You start working toward that. That was pretty much the process that I followed. I wasn't that involved with any of the politics, or I'm sure at the time, I think Larry or somebody told me we were doing a TV advertisement for this. I thought, oh, cool. But there wasn't any comics were such a, you didn't have time to go, we're going to do a TV issue, so that means we're going to spend extra on this, and we're going to do this or that. It was just kind of like, great, we're going to have a TV, commercial. How we worked as artists, it wasn't going to affect me that much. Maybe Larry was more aware of it because he was getting more of the direct editorial input, but it certainly wasn't, I wasn't getting a call going, we're doing a TV ad for this, so make sure you do your best work. But, I didn't get any of that.
I think Mark is specifically also asking here about were those issues perhaps done earlier in advance?
No, the only one I think that was done in advance was the first one I worked on, issue 9, or maybe it was 10. I don't know. One of those was,
That fill-in issue by
yeah.
Stephen Grant.
I think I
Okay.
did those like 4 or 5 months before, and then, or a couple months before maybe, and then so that they had somebody when Herb left who could fill right in.
Mike, this question is less a question and more a statement and an acknowledgement, and just a microphone and a spotlight and a soapbox. So, when someone says your name, I think of your signature VOZ, and I think of your year on GI Joe, and then I'm reminded that you did all of these other interesting stuff, and also the GI Joe cartoon and all these other comics. And because I'm such a GI Joe guy, I think of you as artist, right? Like penciler and penciler inker. And it takes me a little bit further down the list to remember that you are a writer. You have written a ton of comics, right? So Voodoo Mansion, which is yours, which is creator owned. These 3 titles you have written, and correct me here, in some cases co-written. Voodoo Mansion, the book that collects all that, is over 100 pages. Laurie Lovecraft, the book that collects all those comics, is 350 pages. Retro Wood, the book that collects all those comics, is 300 pages. And these are 3 books that you have self-published, which people can order from you right now. There was that 3-issue miniseries in the 90s for the epic revival at Marvel, Offcasts, which you didn't just draw, but you wrote. So can you, A, talk a little about being a writer, and B, just promote your stuff, since we have forced you into the time machine for this very narrow slice of your career?
I think I did Lori back in like '96. I had someone out here who was a distributor. I think his name Fred Krueger was his name, and he said, "Mike, you ought to do your own comic. I'd publish it." So I thought about it, and went, "Okay," and I did it together. And by the time I got it done, Fred had moved out of the business. So I think Caliber Comics did it, and that was when I worked on the HBO series Tales from the Crypt. Every week we'd have this beautiful young actress who'd come in, and she was the new star, the new hot thing in town. And you realize like 6 months later, nobody's going to know her name. It was just the way the business went. And I thought, so I created this character, actually recreated her because I had done some earlier stuff for Star Reach with a character named Linda Lovecraft. But all my friends and everyone kept asking me, like, are you still doing those Linda Lovelace comics? Who was like, the big porn star at the time. So I thought, okay, I got to change this name. So when I redid the stories, I did them as Laurie Lovecraft, and she was this actress who, she was 24 and she was already past, time had passed her by. She was going to be on the scrap heap. So she turns into, sorcery, which she's not any better at. But the stories were all kind of pastiches of my favorite films. And actors and actresses that were in them. I mean, certainly I did Alfred Hitchcock as a character, and Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, William Powell. Her boyfriend was Bob Hope. So it gave me a chance to cast all these characters in my comics. And I think for writing, the biggest influence was probably Will Eisner in Spirit. These weren't angst-driven, solemn stories. They were just like, hey, we're here to have fun. For the Laurie stories, my friend Pete Ventrella would wind up. We would do the plots together, and he would wind up doing the writing on them. And when I actually did did my writing, I'd look at his and just go like, oh man, I was nowhere near that accomplished a writer. But they were all, like I said, the stories were all fun to do. And like I said, I got them all put together now in this omnibus. So, after I did Laurie, I kind of moved on to the other Hollywood thing I did was something called Retrowood. And it was a chance for me to do like a something that took place in a faux Hollywood back in the Depression era. And I was really influenced by Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and those characters. So again, they gave me a chance to do a black and white series with these characters in them, and it was fun work to do. And about that, about in 2013, I think I kind of retired from doing a lot of work elsewhere, so I could just concentrate on these comics. I think one of the first ones I did a series called The Mad Mummy, which is basically it was a character who was a high priestess, and he gets in a love triangle with a couple. One is his wife, and one of his is the queen, who wants him to usher in this new age, and really messes up his life. So he winds up as this immortal, mummy, and it's 3,000 years later he winds up reuniting with these two women, and it's like they haven't forgotten a single thing. He's still, his problems with that. So again, with all these stories, they're kind of a light touch. Voodoo Mansion was kind of my Twilight Zone things. It's the whole concept of Voodoo Mansion was once you entered Voodoo Mansion, there were these doorways, and when you took that doorway, you had no idea where you were going to wind up. And people usually went there to resolve some issue in their past, and would give them a chance to, to reconnect with these people and either have closure or wind up being, completely screwed and with whoever they met. So, but I love doing graphic stories. So, I mean, I'm still continuing to work on them. It's like I've got a new story with like both the Mad Mummy and the detective from Retrowood. So I mean, it's people ask me like, why are you still doing this stuff? And I'm going, well, if I didn't, I'd be sitting there all day long going like, oh, that hurts there. Ooh, So it's you stay busy as self-preservation. So.
And for people that just want to check out some of your independent work, is the best place to go on your website, Vozart, and order it there?
Vozart, it's you can read comics for free. You can look at some of my my Hollywood paintings.
But in addition to reading comics for free, they can also send money to you, and then you will send them books, right? Okay. Mike just walked away from the microphone and he said, exactly.
Yeah, you mentioned money, I'm coming back. So, but I mean, it's like a lot of times I'll spend like this is like one I did of John Hamm from Mad Men. See who else is there? It's like this was Dinah Rigg and Vincent Price from Theater of Blood.
Mike, are these acrylic?
Yeah, I use acrylic, but I use it like watercolor. I put on thin washes. Indian Marion. This one. Jane Fonda from Spirits of the Dead. So I mean, I find stuff that I like in again, doing the painting forces me to become better at drawing and whatever, and I enjoy doing it, and gives me a chance to give some nice gifts to friends. It's that kind of thing.
Speaking of more modern work, this is one that I had behind me. Whoop, here we go. There we go. Featuring this character, shady looking character in the corner behind Cobra Commander.
Oh, did I do that for
you? that was your commission for me. So your this was the concept behind this commission was sort of. I looked at the end of your work on G.I. Joe as being like almost the end of season 2. Like all of the main Cobras seem to have either died or have been apprehended, and it's like, where do you go from here? So this was, in my mind, kind of like a potential cover for if you had continued on to maybe onto issue 25 or something like that, with echo, with the homage to Days of Future Past on there as
Mark, I think everything we've learned from Mike and from G.I. Joe is that had Mike continued, the cover to 25 would have had a whole bunch of new characters and gear and vehicles to draw.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that's how it all worked. But on the initial version of this, Mike did take an opportunity to radically redesign Storm Shadow as well. So always with an eye to the new. So yeah, it's interesting as well just to see your sort of work on G.I. Joe has just really continued with all of the commissions that you've kept on doing and posting onto your website and your social media. And I think we saw one just maybe a week or two ago as we record this from one of our friends, Shane, who you did a snow job illustration for him.
Mike, will you, in addition to taking money for your books that you have drawn and published, will you take money for drawings and send them to people? Are you doing commissions these days?
I will do commissions, but it's the payment on this stuff is more of an ego thing than anything else. It's and it's like I said, like doing this thing for Shane. It was like, oh wow, that's fun. But I mean, often when people have commissions, if you have aspirations to be a comic book editor, I probably don't want to do it for you. It's like do this character and do it the way you do it. It's like it's fun. But when it starts to get into like, oh yeah, I want him to turn a little bit, and I want him to, it's like, oh wait, that's work. And basically for doing this stuff, I charge kind of a flat rate that's very affordable. And
you are not interested in taking art direction, is what you're saying.
well, if
you're taking minimal art direction.
Sometimes people will bring things up and it's like, yeah, that's a great idea. But I mean, it's once they've given me the idea, I have to think like, okay, I have to draw that. Is that going to be fun to draw or not? And it might be a great idea, but it's like, it's not what I want to do.
I was going to say, and also, can you sneak a cat into the illustration as well? That seems to be.
They're going to be there. That's part of the process. It's I have a contract with my cat that they have to have some kind of cat on the.
Mark, I have run out of questions.
I had just a couple of finishing thoughts. One is Torpedo, when he appeared in pages of G.I. Joe at the Treasury Building. He was drawn with flippers in the Treasury Building, which I assume is just a pure Mike Vosberg touch of hilarity, which I just wanted to pause on for just a second. It might be that you've got absolutely no comment to make on that other.
I probably looked at the doll and went, he's got flippers on. It's like, I don't design these things. So
my other thought was just to mention as well that obviously G.I. Joe has changed publisher again. So it was at IDW for a very long time. It's now shifted to Skybound and Image, who are producing amazing new work. And they have been contacting some of the G.I. Joe legends. Do you have any interest in doing any future G.I. Joe work, whether it's a trading card or a cover, if the call comes from Skybound?
If they're reprinting the books, if they're paying royalties on them, I'm interested in, it's like if they want something, I'm interested in doing that stuff. It'd be fun. But like I said, that's really been a sore point with me of watching material like that where it gets reprinted without a payment. So, but again, I'm so far removed from anything in the business that I have no idea who I've been working for there or what they're like or whatever. So my attitude is always like, never say never. But question will be answered on the day that you want me to do something. It's like, okay, I can do that. Yeah, so
if they call you, at least answer the phone.
yeah,
And my final point was that I almost forgot about Dre. I just wanted to call out the fact that you have had a successful career in storyboarding for music videos, including the likes of Dr. Dre. So I just wanted to
50 Cent. I think it was, who was the other one? Stefani. Who's the one who just Marilyn Manson? I was always amused when I'm thinking like, do these people know this is this old white guy is doing all the rap storyboard things, and on the other hand, it was a great experience because storyboarding first. I think one of the Eminem things. I'm like, God, as long as I don't have to listen to the music, I'll do something. And then I listened to the music, did the words, and went, Jesus, this is one of the most astute storytellers that I've come across. I was, it was that old thing about
this is Stan by Eminem.
yeah, that prejudice you have from the beginning of who these people were, and it's like I got to meet Dr. Dre. It was like, oh wait, this guy's more like Bill Cosby. But that was the good days before we discovered who Bill Cosby was.
Oh crikey, yes, yeah, that's a whole different thing.
So I mean,
But the overall idea is that Mike Vosberg, you are a working illustrator.
yes,
You are interested in drawing for yourself, in learning, and also you are an illustrator for hire who will draw illustrations and comics and storyboards for a variety of clients and outlets.
I should tell you that when I was doing storyboards the last year or so, somebody gave me a they were wanted us to fill out a like a little resume thing of telling us like why we wanted to work, and like why we wanted to work for a certain director. And I got to that question. I said, well, actually, I think the director should call me and explain why I want to work for him. So and that's kind of my attitude about doing drawing now. It's like I'd like to do it, but as long as it's not as long as it's not work, as long as it's fun. It's like, yeah, I'd like to do that, but I mean, it's sometimes you get commissions like I'm on all 7 GI Joe and they're interacting, and it's like, oh my God, it's like that's
Well, there goes my commission
Yeah.
idea.
well,
Yeah, can't you just have Duke petting some cats instead?
it's like I don't know if the cats always have to fit into GI Joe, but
So I think we're done. I think you want to have your lunch. So probably just remains for me to thank you so much, Mike, for your time and spending it with us. And I'm sure the Talking Joe listeners will be very appreciative of hearing your story, of GI Joe, but more widely, around everything else as well. It's a fascinating career that you've had.
And I want to, like I said, hey, thank you guys for putting up with me for a couple hours here and listening to these stories. And you hit the key right there. Was before I worked in comics, I was a janitor, I was a school teacher. I'm trying to think what else I did along the line there. And drawing has been a whole lot more fun than anything else, and probably more rewarding. So again, thank you for having me here today.
Great. And as we wrap up, if you are new to Talking Joe, you can find us at talkingjoe.co.uk. That's the website that points to where we are. And Tim, when you're not talking to me about G.I. Joe and other things, you can be found at a number of places.
Video essays on TV and film at our YouTube channel with my partners in New York. That's at Atomic Abe. I own a comic book store right outside of Boston, Hub Comics, and I write about G.I. Joe at my blog, arealamericanbook.com.
So I think that is us done. But before we go, let's just remind people, Tim, that
Nobody Beats Talking Joe, an international podcast.
You weren't expecting that, Mike.
No one expects a Spanish position.
Laters.
And I don't think I ever saw any of those ads on TV. I wasn't watching Saturday morning TV enough.
Well, your cover for issue, is it 11? The Arctic one where they're on the little tank. That was on TV at the end of the commercial, that like animated scenes that would be in that issue. So it's 29 seconds of animation. It's like the movie version of that issue that you and Larry did. And then the final moment is the cover. And Jackson Beck, famous actor, voice actor, says, "What happens next? Find out in Marvel Comics." And it shows your cover.
So I was getting comic book covers on TV long before Tales in the Crypt. Who knew?